with that. Well, I'm reminded today how technology doesn't always work sometimes when I'm reminded today that God can work through any system. Sometimes I think we look at the world today and we say, how is God going to do something? How is he going to show up? How is he going to work out his plans? Now, I think most people affirm that God is all-powerful, nothing can stop his plans. But sometimes we see the world in front of us and we get a little concerned about what is or isn't happening. And it makes us anxious. It makes us just a little queasy at times. So whatever system we're talking about, whether it's a completely free system or a completely oppressive system, God can work out his purposes through any system that we encounter. But when we look at the book of Judges, we're going to look at chapter 4, but chapter 4 and 5 are kind of together. Chapter 4 is the kind of the historical narrative, while chapter 5 is more the spiritual narrative or concept of what happens in chapter 4. But in Judges chapter 4, or in the book of Judges, we find that women play an instrumental role in the book. In fact, the book of Judges has more women than any other book in the Bible. It has 19 women that are main characters in the actual story. But why I bring that up is because how women are treated in the book of Judges shows the spiritual health of Israel. At the beginning of the book, we see that women are treated well, like good human beings, like they should be. But as we get further and further in the book of Judges, we see that women are treated less and less and less. And eventually we get to the end of Judges, and the last woman in the book of Judges is literally chopped up into pieces. Like that's how far Israel goes on its spiritual journey, that it's not good in many ways. And so we come to Judges chapter 4, and we find that Israel has sinned again, that Israel is doing things that are not what God wants them to do. But this particular story is odd from all the other Judges stories in the sense of every other story about Judges has a single leader, has a single person who's in charge. We talked about Othniel, we talked about Ehud, you may remember Gideon and Samson. There's just one person, but this one has three, and it's actually really hard who is the actual judge in this category. But in Judges chapter 4, verse 1, it starts saying, after Ehud's death, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight again. So the Lord turned them over to King Jabin of Hazor, a Canaanite king. The commander of his army was Sisera. Sisera, who had 900 chariots, ruthlessly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help. So the cycle has restarted. We're back. We had Othniel, then we have Ehud, and now we're back to the same cycle where the Israelites did evil. Now with Ehud, Israel had peace for 80 years, which was by far the longest period of peace that they had. And we have to be careful about a direct cause and effect relationship here. Because Judges is not talking about the prosperity gospel. Well, if you say faithful to God, you're going to have all these worldly blessings. That's not what's trying to be portrayed here. It's more important to talk about the spiritual health of the individuals, because when Ehud died, there was a leadership vacuum that happened. That no longer was he leading, and so who would fill that vacuum? Well, it ended up becoming Jabin, the king of Hazor. Now, the name Jabin is a title, like king or president or monarch. It's not an actual person. Because you may remember in Joshua chapter 11, Joshua defeated Jabin and burned the city down. So Jabin is the title of the individual. It's not the actual name. It's a generic term for the Canaanite king. And Hazor is a major city. From about 1800 to 1200 BC, it was a happening place. It was on a major trade route, so it was a place that had a lot of power, a lot of influence, a lot of wealth on it. And we see part of their wealth with the 900 chariots, 900 iron chariots that Sisera had at his disposal. In Judges chapter 1, as Judah, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, is trying to conquer their area of the promised land, they are defeated, or they do not defeat one of the enemies, because the enemy had iron chariots. So iron chariots are a big deal. On many levels, they're kind of like the modern day tank. How it would function is there was a person driving. Do you drive a chariot? I don't know. Whoever is the one holding the reins of the horses. The person is driving the chariot, and then there are two other soldiers with him. They could have bows or spears or bows. They're all other sorts of weapons. But chariots were fast, easily maneuverable, and very scary for your enemy. And the fact that they were iron shows they were stronger. They could basically destroy the bronze weapons that the enemy had. But the fact that they had iron shows that the Canaanites had a technological advantage over the Israelites. Their weaponry was better. So even though Israel could have had the best soldiers, had the best of everything else, they were handicapped from a technological standpoint. So they ended up becoming oppressed. Sisera oppressed them for 20 years. After 20 years, they finally called out to God for help. Now remember, when Israel cries out to the Lord, it's not a sign of repentance. They're not saying, oh, we did bad, we're sorry, we're going to do better. It's a, hey, I'm sorry we got caught. We tried all these other things on our own, but we couldn't figure it out. And so now they're crying to the Lord for help. And one of the things that I think the book of Judges does for us is it shows how sin tries to hang on, how getting rid of sin is really difficult. But until you get rid of it completely, it's going to keep bothering you. So sin will aggravate until you eradicate it. Until you get rid of it completely, sin is going to keep bothering you. And as I was thinking about this concept of eradicate and how things can continue to linger, it made me think of some of our lovely pests that we have, these bugs that try to infiltrate our house. And probably one of the most feared bugs are spiders. Some people really like spiders. Most people, I think, either don't like them or prefer not to have them around. And I think that's most people. And I remember several years ago, I was talking to a pest control person, and we're talking about the different types of bugs that he tries to treat and kill. And he says, spiders are really difficult for pest control companies to kill because they primarily use sprays. And how sprays are effective is as the insects travel along the ground, they have their pincers and they take particles from the ground and they put it in their mouth to taste them, to kind of see what this area has. And so by doing that, they put the spray down and the insects eat the poison and it takes care of them. Well, spiders don't do that. So the only way for the sprays to be effective on spiders is to actually have it absorb into their body. So if you spray it with the spray directly, or it's still wet. And so spiders, the spray is not super effective with them. The best way to get rid of spiders is to get rid of their food source. When there's no food, the spiders will go somewhere else to find food. But we have these pests like spiders that until we get rid of them completely, they're going to keep coming back. They're going to keep coming and keep coming and keep coming. And sin is like that. So sin has happened in Israel, and we find in verse 4 that Deborah was a prophet who was judging Israel at the time. She would sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites would go to her for judgment. One day she sent for Barak, who lived in Kadesh in the land of Naphtali. She said to him, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, commands you. Call out 10,000 warriors from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun at Mount Tabor. And I will call out Sisera, commander of Jabin's army, along with his chariots and warriors to the Kishon River. There I will give you victory over him." Barak told her, "I will go, but only if you go with me." "Very well," Deborah replied, "I will go with you. But you will receive no honor in this venture, for the Lord's victory over Sisera will be at the hands of a woman." So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh. At Kadesh, Barak called together the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali, and 10,000 warriors went up with him. Deborah also went up with him. Now Heber the Kenite, a descendant of Moses' brother-in-law, had moved away from other members of his tribe and pitched his tent near Kadesh. So we find Deborah enters the scene, and Deborah is unique from all the other judges in the sense that she's the only one who actually spent time in court. When the term judge just makes us think of a court system, and we see that Deborah actually spent time in court. It probably was not a very formal system. She was probably more like an arbitrator or something of that nature. But the reason that she was able to achieve that particular position is because people respected her. People saw that she had gifts, had wisdom, had understanding, and so they submitted to her. It was not as though she had some formal position. She was just someone wise, and people went to her. And one of the reasons we kind of get to that conclusion is that Deborah's authority expanded beyond her own tribe. See, ancient Israel was kind of like the United States in the sense of each tribe was kind of like each state. A tribe was part of the whole country, but it was its own individual, in some ways kind of autonomous, and how it did some of its governing regulations. And so, but Deborah's authority went beyond just one tribe. It went to others. And part of what I find cool about this is that we see how God is not constrained by the boundaries that we have. Whether we're talking about geography or gender or ethnicity or socioeconomic or intelligence, God is not constrained by those boundaries. That whatever we're talking about, God's purpose can come through. And so Deborah is different than all the other judges because all the other judges led by power and force. Deborah led by wisdom and character. Now, the other judges may have had character and wisdom, and Deborah may have had power and force, but Deborah primarily led with wisdom, while the other judges primarily led with force. And so we see a difference there. But Deborah was also a prophet. She shared a prophecy with Barak and saying, this is what is going to happen, that God is giving victory. But there's a command that's tied with the prophecy. It's not as though you could just sit on your hands and do anything. Barak had to go do things, had to go raise an army, had to rally the troops to get together to go and have this time and this battle against him. But Barak asked Deborah to come. I will go, but only if you go with me. And so then we have to ask ourselves, what is actually happening here in the text? What is Barak's motivation here? I would probably say most people would come to the conclusion that Barak had some self-confidence issues or didn't necessarily believe that this was going to happen, that he needed somebody else to actually help him get this accomplished. So maybe it was a lack of faith, whether it was anxiety or fear or whatever that is. Well, but the text is a little ambiguous. Not a little, it's straight up ambiguous here. And it's because another interpretation for it could be that he respected Deborah so much that he wanted to honor her by bringing her along with this in this mission. That he saw her leadership. He saw her authority. He saw all the gifts that said, you should come with us. Right? You are the real leader. And so then Deborah says, well, she agrees to come and says, well, but you won't receive any of the honor. And again, the text is ambiguous. It's hard to read connotation into the text, right? Is Deborah saying that with a negative stigmatism? Well, because of your lack of faith, you're going to receive no honor. Or is that just part of the prophecy of, well, this is a matter of fact. This is what God has given as the prophecy. But Barak was successful that he raised up 10,000 soldiers from Zebulun and Naphtali. And they went to go face the 900 iron chariots. Now, 10,000 versus 900 chariots, it does seem like there would be decent odds at least, but there were other soldiers involved with Sisera and his troops. It's not as though there were just the 900. There were other things to deal with and contend with in the battle. And so it took great faith and courage from Barak and the soldiers to actually go to have this confrontation. But then we have this person called Heber the Kenite who enters the scene. And this story has a lot of different characters, so sometimes it's hard to keep them all straight. But the biggest part is that we see that he is connected to both Israel and to Canaan. He has kind of both sides of it. Now, he's distantly related to Israel. His ancestor was Moses' brother-in-law. So that's a long way. We're talking about 400, 500, 600 years earlier that they had this connection. So it's been a long time since they've actually, they probably didn't go to family reunions anymore after that long. But he's also connected to the Canaanites, and part of it may be that the Canaanites were in control. They were the power in that particular area. So Heber said, I'm going to align myself with the group that's powerful. So about self-preservation, wanted to protect himself, wanted to make sure that he was taken care of. You don't align yourself with the weaker party. You align yourself with the stronger party. You want to look out for yourself. You want to take care of yourself. And there is some speculation that Heber is the actual iron worker who constructed the chariots for Sisera. Like that he had some benefit, that he was essentially the arms dealer benefiting from all this transaction. Now that's speculation. There's nothing specific about it. But we see that things are coming to a head. And there are times where in our life where we have a pest situation that it comes to a head. If you've ever had termites, you recognize that you can't wait to deal with this situation. You've got to go now. You've got to take care of it. It's a matter of we just can't wait for this or see if something else will come from it. But one of the problems with termites is termites need only 1/16 of an inch of a gap in order to infiltrate the structure. Now, most of our structures are on concrete on some level. We have, whether it's a concrete basement with walls, whether it's cinder blocks, whether it's a concrete slab. It's on concrete, and partially it's to protect the wood from rot, but also invading pests. But each termite needs only a 1/16 of an inch in order to get in. And one of the problems with termites is that the spray that they have, if you have a termite infestation, you have to spray everywhere. But the spray only kills those who come in contact with it. If the nest is outside of the home, which it can be, then in order to get rid of the termites, you have to have some type of bait that the termites take back into the nest to kill all those termites in the nest. Otherwise, they'll keep coming back. They'll find a way around the spray. They'll find ways to infiltrate the house in other ways. My point is that sin will continue to aggravate until we eradicate it, until we get rid of it completely. So we continue in verse 12. When Sisera was told that Barak had gone up to Mount Tabor, he called for all 900 of his iron chariots and all his warriors, and they marched to the Kishon River. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Get ready. This is the day the Lord will give you victory over Sisera, for the Lord is marching ahead of you." So Barak led his 10,000 warriors down the slopes of Mount Tabor into battle. When Barak attacked, the Lord threw Sisera and his chariots and warriors into a panic. Sisera leaped down from his chariots and escaped on foot. Then Barak chased the chariots and the enemy, killing Sisera's warriors. Not a single one was left alive. Now, this is where we really start to pull a little bit from chapter 5, because there's some details that chapter 5 has that aren't necessarily part of chapter 4. See, most people would say that this was the dry season. The Kishon River only had water in it when it was the wet season, when it was raining. But when the dry season, the riverbed dried up, and you could walk across, and chariots could go across it with no problem. Because chariots don't really work in muddy ground. That would not be a place that they could maneuver. They'd get stuck. They'd become a liability. What we find in chapter 5, verse 20 and 21, it says, God caused rain to turn the battlefield into mud. So it's dry season, so they could go on the riverbed of the Kishon River and have their battle, but then God caused it to rain, which threw the army into a panic. And in that moment, Deborah tells Barak, now is the time. Go now. God is giving you this victory. You cannot wait. God was ready to deliver Israel. But the problem is that there was some hesitation. In chapter 5, verse 13 to 18, we find that not all joined in the attack. There was hesitation. There was indecision. There were some of the soldiers that were part of Barak's army that were like, I don't know if we can do this. I don't know if we should go. I don't know if we have the force behind us to make this worth it. See, what's happening is everyone is trying to decide what is right in their own minds. And this is a huge problem in the book of Judges. In Judges 21:25, it says, every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And what happens is that we no longer are part of the whole. We're individuals only looking out for ourselves. And so that's what some of the soldiers were doing, a part of Barak's army. But I fear that's a lot of what the followers of Jesus do as well. We only look out for ourselves. Is this advantageous for us? Will I get something from this? Is this going to benefit me in the long run? Instead of being part of the movement that Jesus has called us to be a part of, we're doing it for ourselves. And so this is a subtle but important shift in the book of Judges. Because when Joshua was leading, and then when Othniel was the judge, we see that when those leaders called to action, everybody moved. Everybody joined. Everyone was part of it. But now we see there's some hesitation. I don't know if I want to commit to this. I don't know if I want to give my life to this. I don't know if I want to make sacrifices for this. I don't know if it's right for me. It may be right for you, but it's not right for me. And so we're making our commitments relative. We're making our truth relative. And there are many followers of Jesus who do that. And then there are people who are outside the church looking in saying, man, this is a group of people that don't know what they're doing. This group of people that are so disoriented that why would we want to be part of this dysfunctional group that doesn't seem to have it all together? See, many people say they're willing to risk for Jesus, but they don't want to go all in. And so this concept of sin keeps creeping up in our life. We don't want to go all in. We don't want to fully commit. So sin continues to aggravate us. But even in the midst of imperfection, God moved. And Sisera's men were moved to a panic. Now, if we take a step back and think for a minute, Sisera and his men, they were seasoned warriors. They knew what it took. These weren't just some new people fresh out of camp. They were seasoned warriors, and they had superior weaponry. They entered that battle with all the confidence in the world, knowing that they were more powerful than the enemy. But then rain comes. And if we recognize and remember that Canaanites served this god called Baal, then we say, oh, this is a bigger deal than we may have thought. See, Baal was the god of rain. He was the god of fertility and growth and rain. And so they're sitting there, they're getting ready for battle, and they're maybe making sacrifices to their god Baal and doing all these things to appease him. And they get into the battle, and this god that they're trying to serve is bringing a rainstorm during the dry season. Well, that would cause me to panic a little bit if I felt that my deity that I was serving was out against me. I would make me a little nervous. And so Sisera and his men were nervous. They were scared. They panicked and they fled. And in that moment, God gave victory over Sisera. The victory was absolute. It's complete. No one was left. Now there was victory, but there was still more work to do. This battle did not end the story, because we must completely destroy the enemy. Sin will continue to aggravate until we eradicate, until we get rid of it completely. We can't just say, well, we had a victory. We've got to destroy it. Another pest that we have that can come into our home sometimes is that of bed bugs. And as I was thinking about bed bugs, I was thinking lice has a very similar kind of connotation to it. In order to get rid of like lice and bed bugs, one of the things you have to do is every piece of clothing and towels and sheets, you have to run it through the dryer for so long on a high to kill every single bug. And I'm telling you what, if you just take a moment, think of all the clothes you have. Think of all the towels you have. That's not a half-a-day project. And then you got to fold everything. And so it just kind of adds insult to injury. And you have to kill each individual bug separately. And one of the problems with bed bugs is they're real small. They can hide in real small spaces. And you have to kill each bug individually. Another thing is they can be dormant for quite a while, even up to a couple months if there's no food source. And they reproduce quickly, so they grow rapidly. And it's an invitation that you have to get rid of. You have to kill each bug individually. And if you miss one, there's a chance that you hadn't done anything worthwhile. Okay, keep coming back. And that's the problem with sin. If we don't eradicate it, if we don't get rid of it completely, it keeps coming back. Well, if that's where the story of Judges 4 ends, it would kind of be a bit of a normal story, but it doesn't. If you're not familiar with this story, it takes kind of an unexpected turn if we continue in verse 17. It says, meanwhile, Sisera ran to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because Heber's family was on friendly terms with King Jabin of Hazor. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, come into my tent, sir. Come in, don't be afraid. So he went into her tent, and she covered him with a blanket. Please give me some water, he said. I'm thirsty. So she gave him milk from a leather bag and covered him again. Stand at the door of the tent, he told her. If anybody comes and asks you if there is anybody here, say no. But when Sisera fell asleep from exhaustion, Jael quietly crept up to him with a hammer and tent peg in her hand. Then she drove the tent peg through his temple into the ground, and so he died. When Barak came looking for Sisera, Jael went out to meet him. She said, come, and I will show you the man you are looking for. So he followed her into her tent and found Sisera laying there dead, with the tent peg through his temple. So on that day, Israel saw God defeat Jabin, the Canaanite king. And from that time on, Israel became stronger and stronger against Jabin until they finally destroyed him. So Sisera escaped the battlefield, and he fled. He was running. He was in danger. He probably had a lot of anxiety. And I imagine at that point, he didn't have much hope, but yet he saw something. He found refuge. He knew that Heber was on friendly terms with his people, and so he went there to seek refuge and be with them. And Jael was Heber's wife, so Sisera felt safe. Maybe not completely safe and secure. Maybe there was still some anxiety, but he was exhausted from the battle, exhausted from running. He sought sanctuary and security and rest. He wanted to sleep. Part of what might have given him some type of security is that from a societal standpoint, culturally speaking, a man was not supposed to enter the tent unless it was your tent with your wife. Like for Sisera to enter the tent with Jael was culturally unacceptable and not normal. So he didn't think any other man would come into the tent. So if soldiers came to the tent, Jael would say, you can't come in because this is her tent and her husband wasn't there. So there's some hospitality protocol that happens in the ancient Near East that I think is interesting at least to consider. And the first off is that travelers were invited to stay in the home, and they were only to be invited by the head of house, or the male who was the head of house. He was the only person who was supposed to extend an invitation, and by accepting the invitation, guests would move from enemy to ally. If they accepted it, they were saying that I am your friend, and so that they could be together and be fine. And his hospitality was for a set amount of time, but it could be extended if desired. Now, the guests could refuse the hospitality, but it would have been an insult to the host, and so you have to possibly navigate that a little bit. And it's a little hard for us to think of if somebody's walking by your house, you're not going to invite them in to stay for the night. Maybe you will, but I've never heard of anybody actually doing that in our day and time now. But guests were expected to not make any requests. They were to accept everything that the host offered them because the host was expected to provide the best that they could for the guests. So as they understand, the host is going to provide the best, so the guests should not humiliate the host by asking for something even better. Now, I do find it interesting that part of the understanding is that the guest was supposed to share news of the world. And so this was kind of like the ancient grapevine of how rumors spread or news spread, of supposed to share news of what was happening around on their travels. And as long as the guests stayed, the host was obligated to provide protection. So that was that's the hospitality protocols. And Sisera was asking for protection. But really, Jael gave him better than what he wanted. He asked for water, she gave him milk. She gave him a place to sleep. She covered him. She gave him rest. Now, on some levels, Jael is in a bit of a compromising situation. She is a woman and alone in a tent with a man who is not her husband. He could have taken advantage of her. But instead of actually having that type of scene, we see that she is kind of like the mother. Some of the versions say that he actually laid her head in his lap and he slept. That she covered him with a blanket. She provided a safe place for him. She gave him milk. She was acting like his mother. Until she picked up the tent peg and the hammer. And as I said, the story takes a real unexpected turn if you're not familiar with it. Now, in this culture, women were the ones who typically constructed the tents. Right? When they would move from one place to the other, the women would tear them down and they would set them up. So Jael would have been very comfortable handling the hammer and the peg, something she was used to doing. And so through that, she killed Sisera, and God delivered Israel. And this fulfilled Deborah's prophecy that victory would come at the hand of a woman. And in the ancient world, being killed by a woman was a disgrace to a warrior. It was not something they would have rather died on battlefield than in this situation. But I do think it is good to take a step back and not gloss over what actually happens here, because Jael, she broke at least 2 of the 10 commandments. She lied to Sisera, and she committed murder. Now, maybe you could make a plea for this to be being part of war and battle. I'm not sure about that. But the reality is, this is not a clean story. A couple weeks ago, we looked at the story of Ehud, and we talked about how sin causes a mess that only God can clean up. When we sin, messes happen. And I'm not saying to this particular gruesome extent. That's not where I'm trying to go with it. But to recognize that sin causes problems in our life. And we need to be wise, not just to gloss over the mess that sin causes. Because until we completely eradicate it, it will continue to aggravate. Sin will continue to cause problems in our life until we gruesomely deal with it. But this story also shows a little bit of a shift. In the 2 previous stories, we see that God gave Othniel and he had victory, and then there was peace. There's no peace listed at the end of the story. It's Israel grew stronger, Jabin grew weaker. The deliverance took a while to actually occur. So what was happening? What was going on? And then we say, well, who was the true judge? Was it Deborah? Was it Barak? Was it Jael? How do we differentiate between that? I think most people incline to Deborah because it actually calls her a judge at the beginning. And she seems to be more of a main character than the others. But the reality is, we see sin can creep back into our life. And this is the 3rd cycle in Judges, and there are many more to come, and they get worse and worse and worse and worse. And until we eradicate sin, it will continue to aggravate. The last pest I have on my list here are cockroaches. Nobody enjoys seeing a cockroach. Nobody says, ooh, a cockroach, let me go get a closer look. And that's not how we view them. And cockroaches are difficult to eradicate on some levels. First off, they're very resilient animals. Their exoskeleton is so strong that they're somewhat resistant to being squished, which is kind of gross when you think about it anyway. But another thing that cockroaches do is a lot of times they'll carry their eggs and babies on their back, which will prevent them from getting in contact with any pesticide that we put out there, any spray. And so those animals, the babies will continue to live even though if the parent doesn't. And each cockroach can have over 1,000 offspring every year. Well, that multiplies quickly, right? I mean, they keep coming, they keep coming. They can squeeze into really small places relative to their actual size. And we see that they're gross, they have disease, and it's just not a great thing to know that you have cockroaches wherever you are. But that's kind of how sin is. Sin finds a way to survive. It finds a way to hang on. It finds ways to cause problems in your life, to weasel its way back in. Because sometimes I think we have fully dealt with it, but we haven't. And so maybe for a while we've suppressed it, but it regains strength and it comes back with a vengeance. But fortunately, we have a Savior who died, who has overcome the world so that we can overcome the world. He's invited us to do that. But in order for that to happen, we've got to be real about it. We've got to look at our life and say, have I dealt with the actual sin in my life? Whatever we're talking about. And I could stand up here and list a bunch of different sins. I probably miss half the ones that you're dealing with. Because sin is a real issue. And if we think we have overcome sin completely, I think we're fooling ourselves. Like, we believe that Jesus can transform us. We believe that Jesus can change us, but we aren't Jesus. I'm not Jesus. Sin is still a problem. Temptations arise in life. But until we actually have this honest conversation and deal with it to eradicate it, it's going to keep aggravating us. It's going to keep coming up.